When the topic of Ebola virus disease comes up, there's a lot of fear, which is completely understandable, as this is a dangerous disease that is readily transmissible. But quite often people jump from the actual serious threat of spread by direct contact to hypothetical scenarios. Could the Ebola virus mutate, transforming into a virus that's transmitted by airborne spread, creating the possibility of a much wider outbreak? This line of thinking spreads readily into the possibility of a global pandemic. You might say, isn't it scary enough without making it worse? But these are serious questions. And it's not hard to see why someone might worry that a virus that is already lethal might become even more transmissible and therefore even more of a threat. And contagion, contamination, especially by invisible, undetected agents, can easily scare people. Where is it coming from? Who's responsible? Look no further than the current outbreak in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where efforts to bring the disease under control are hampered not only by the war and distrust that I discussed here, but also by the idea among some in the region that the outbreak is actually a poison invented by the international community. So let's take on the issue of whether the Ebola virus or the Ebola viruses could mutate in such a way as to become transmissible by an airborne mode. Now, I'm not a virologist, and I'm not playing one in this video, only an onlooker examining the scientific literature and the opinions of experts. But I do look to science to inform me on matters of medicine and disease. So my approach to this question of Ebola and its transmission is to look at what the fields of virology, infectious disease, and epidemiology have to tell us. This is not an overview of Ebola virus disease in general, but is narrowly focused on the question of transmission. If we are looking at whether Ebola could change its mode of transmission, the starting point is to define its actual mode now. This mode is called direct contact, which means that infection is spread by contact with the blood or bodily fluids of people who are sick with the disease. Blood and bodily fluids of symptomatic individuals contain high numbers of virus particles, though people are not contagious before they become ill themselves. As small cuts in the skin or mucosa are quite common, the virus spreads from person to person when one comes in contact with the blood or bodily fluids of a person with Ebola virus disease. When we talk about a switch to an airborne mode of transmission, what are we talking about? This term, airborne, is traditionally used to describe diseases transmitted when residue from evaporated droplets, called droplet nuclei, or dust particles containing pathogens, can remain suspended in air for long periods of time. These organisms have to be able to survive long periods outside the body. In airborne transmission, the infected person could be long gone from the area and still transmit disease. Airborne transmission allows organisms to enter the upper or lower respiratory tract. Fortunately, only a few diseases are transmitted this way. These include chickenpox, measles, and the bacterial disease tuberculosis. Let's contrast that with droplet contact transmission, which is a very different form of transmission through the air. Droplets containing pathogens can be produced when a person coughs, sneezes, or talks, or during certain medical procedures such as intubation or bronchoscopy. These droplets quickly settle out of the air. Often the viruses are too heavy or too large to be airborne for long periods of time. So with some viral diseases, if a person is in direct proximity of an individual expelling virus-containing droplets, let's say within a few feet, disease can be spread through contact with the eyes or mucous membranes, including those of the upper respiratory tract. This category of diseases includes mumps, meningococcal meningitis, and the bacterial disease pertussis. So if the concern is that Ebola could be spread through the air via droplet contact with someone who's in close proximity, most experts would agree that that's possible. And this is why the current procedure for healthcare workers in the field is to wear face protection goggles and mask, or face shield. Although it should be noted that no actual cases of this kind of transmission have been documented. But this droplet contact transmission is not what people are generally worried about when considering a mutation to airborne transmission. The big scary concern is that Ebola could mutate to have the capacity to spread by a new and different means, not droplet contact, but true airborne transmission like measles or chickenpox. Let's look at general responses to this proposal and then examine some of the arguments for the possibility of airborne spread. First, virologists will point out that viruses, including Ebola, mutate quite readily and rapidly, and that despite this, no virus in nature has ever been observed to change its primary mode of transmission. This is not to say that it's impossible, just that we've never seen it, and it's a reason to be skeptical. For example, despite the infection of over 75 million people since the beginning of the epidemic in the 1970s, HIV is still spread by direct contact, primarily through sexual contact or the sharing of infected needles, occasionally through childbirth, rarely these days through transfusions of contaminated blood. All the mutations of the virus taking place in all of those people with the infection haven't changed this basic reality. And the same is true for every known other virus species. Second, the Ebola virus or Ebola viruses have likely been involved in occasional infections of humans over a long period of time, largely unrecognized, without mutating in a way to change their mode of transmission, and likely have been making copies of themselves, possibly for millions of years, in their animal host, thought to be probably a bat, also without developing the capacity to become airborne. Third, viruses, like animals and plants, are also subject to natural selection. Virologists tell us that even if an Ebola virus did undergo some set of mutations or alterations that did make it possible to be transmitted airborne, in order for it to proliferate, that change would have to give it an advantage in proliferation over an ordinary Ebola virus. But because Ebola virus is already spread efficiently and effectively, any selective pressure for it to become airborne is likely minimal. Fourth, scientists have been monitoring the virus closely since the first known outbreak in 1976. While all viruses mutate as part of their ordinary behavior, a recent study looked at DNA changes in the Zaire Ebola virus from 1976 to 2014. And concluded that there was no evidence that the virus was becoming more contagious or more easily spread. And in fact, in modern Western hospital settings, outside of conditions of poverty, poor health, poor nutrition, and limited medical resources, we are quite good at caring for patients with Ebola, monitoring their status, and treating them until they've recovered. Of the 11 cases treated in the United States, 9 have recovered with care. And both deaths occurred in people who were critically ill before they began to receive medical attention. Concern was exacerbated by this influential 2014 opinion piece in the New York Times published during the West African Ebola virus epidemic by epidemiologist and public health specialist Michael Osterholm, titled "What We're Afraid to Say About Ebola." In it, Osterholm expresses the concern that Ebola could mutate to become transmissible by the airborne route. Naturally, this was widely disseminated in the media and contributed to a great deal of concern and fear. In the middle of a disastrous actual epidemic, spread by actual direct contact, people were becoming afraid of a potential kind of transmission that had never happened before or since. Osterholm anticipated in the article that he would be criticized for unduly alarming people, and in this prediction he was correct. Science journalist Carl Zimmer has a fascinating description of his conversations with virologists about Osterholm's concerns, which I link to in the description. These responses range from unlikely but not impossible, to it can be viewed as a scare tactic, to you can make a hypothesis about anything, but a hypothesis about potential isn't very strong. Osterholm and colleagues in a 2015 review are clearer with regard to airborne transmission, saying, quote, "We agree that this is an improbable but not impossible scenario," unquote, while encouraging ongoing caution and surveillance. I think it's worth looking more closely at Osterholm's argument. In his 2014 New York Times piece, Osterholm says the following, quote, "In 2012, a team of Canadian researchers proved that Ebola Zaire, the same virus that is causing the West Africa outbreak, could be transmitted by the respiratory route, from pigs to monkeys, both of whose lungs are very similar to those of humans. Richard Preston's 1994 bestseller, The Hot Zone, chronicled a 1989 outbreak of a different strain, Ebola restin virus, among monkeys at a quarantine station near Washington. The virus was transmitted through breathing, and the outbreak ended only when all the monkeys were euthanized. We must consider that such transmissions could happen between humans if the virus mutates," unquote. Osterholm is referring to a 2012 Canadian study showing transmission from pigs to monkeys. We knew that pigs can produce infectious large aerosol droplets more efficiently than other species. In this study, pigs infected with the Zaire Ebola virus, oronasally, were housed in a room with caged macaque monkeys, and the monkeys all became infected. Here's a picture of the setup. But the researchers do not claim that this is an example of airborne transmission. They're careful to acknowledge that, quote, "the design and size of the animal cubicle did not allow to distinguish whether the transmission was by aerosol, small or large droplets in the air, or droplets created during floor cleaning which landed inside the cages. All we know is that pigs transmitted the disease, and we learn nothing from this experiment about the means of transmission, and nothing at all about the possibility of Ebola virus mutating to transmit disease by the airborne mode." As far as the case of restin virus in monkeys, as dramatized in Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, Osterholm says the virus was transmitted through breathing. This claim is perplexing, as no definitive conclusion about how the monkeys were infected has ever been reached. The virus is found in urine and feces, and workers were cleaning the area housing the monkeys with pressure hoses and water. This could certainly spread virus particles, and in a way that would be misleading to describe as transmission by breathing. So back to the original question, could Ebola virus change its mode of transmission to become airborne, to initiate a global pandemic in this way? Well, it's impossible to prove that something can't happen or won't happen. But the history of this virus species, the history of actual Ebola outbreaks and transmission patterns, and the lack of change of mode of transmission in any virus species in nature, all suggest that the worry about airborne transmission is overblown. Let's not underestimate the tremendous potential for viruses to innovate. They mutate, they alter, and something as serious as Ebola virus disease needs to be taken very seriously. We ought to remain cautious, not overconfident, to respect the potential inventiveness of the virus, and to continue to examine the epidemiology and natural history of the disease. But we ought also to remain skeptical of hypotheses that are remote and unlikely. Just as viruses are inventive and innovative, so is the human imagination in its capacity to envision the wonderful and the terrible. It is our task to remain sufficiently grounded that we can distinguish what we can imagine from what we need to be most concerned about. Be sure to subscribe, hit the notification button, and thanks a lot for watching.